Today's class is on what is test data and what are the types of test data. So the first question that arises is, what is test data? Put simply, test data is any data that is used in testing. So for instance, if you're testing a system, you would want to give some input to the system. That input data is the test data. When the system accepts the input and processes it and produces the output, you want to compare that output with some known output. So the output that you are expecting is again test data. Now let us say that if I were testing a website like Wikipedia, so if I were to test the search functionality, I could go to the search text box and enter a search term here like this, and when I press the search button or press the enter key, it takes me to the corresponding article. So the search term that I entered was the test data, and also the entire article that came after the website did the search is again test data. So we can say that test data is of two types. One is the input test data. Input test data is the data that we enter into the system, that we type or somehow enter into the system, and the output test data is what we are expecting the system to provide us. So the test data can be input test data or output test data. Well, when you're testing, that time two possibilities are there. Either at the time of the test you have to come up with the test data at that time, so you can create test data on the fly. Just before the test data is required, you can design the input test data and use it to execute your test. Once the test completes and you have to verify the output of the system, you can verify the output at that time. So test data can be created on the fly, or the test data can be designed before the test. When you write the test case, at that time you can design what is the test data, and you can take several factors into consideration, that you are covering no test data or you have both valid and invalid test data with which to execute the test, and also the test data you can design such that it covers the whole range. Now one useful test is, what if there is no test data given to the system? So let us see an example for this. So here I have the Windows calculator open and nothing is there. I haven't done any operation. I have not entered any numbers or anything. So when I press the equal to button, so I'm forcing the calculator to show me the output, but here I have not given any test data. So the system behaves as expected. It does not crash or give me an error message. It just works when no test data is given, and that can be different from system to system. Another example where I have not given the test data, let us say I want to do an addition. So I enter the first number and I click on the plus operator and I give an equal to. Now here what happens is that since I did not provide the second number, the second input test data to the system, it assumed that the first input and the second input are the same, and with that it showed me the result. So it still worked when the test data was not specified. One more useful test is, what if the test data is invalid? So an example of that is, let us say I have a number. I want to find out the factorial of this number. So I type in the number and click on the factorial operator. So it shows me that this is the factorial of 10. That is 10 into 9 into 8 until it reaches 1. If I provide an invalid input, let us say I want to give such a number, say 1 million, whose factorial is going to be very large, and the Windows calculator cannot process that. So the system correctly indicates that it is an invalid input. The system will not accept such a large number. It cannot store the factorial of such a large number. So in your system also you should test what if the test data is invalid. So for example, if it is a website which requires the login functionality, so you should of course test with a valid username and valid password, but also enter no username and no password and try to log in. So what happens? Does the system give the appropriate error message, or does the system just sit over there doing nothing, or the system still logs you into the system? So you need to test out these different things concerned with the test data. One more useful test for the test data is, does it work for the whole range or not? So the test data can be divided into different equivalence classes. By equivalence class, I mean the different numbers in that class belong to a same category, meaning that even if I choose one or two numbers from the class, that is represented well in my testing. So for instance, let us say I want to find out the cos of a particular angle. So I give 45 and try to find out the cos. So it shows me the correct cosine of that particular angle in degrees. That is what I have selected over here. If I give 90, then it is correctly showing the cosine of 90 degrees as 0. So same way I can move through the entire class and I can give the cos of 360 degrees and it shows it as 1. So that completes all the angles within the circle, and that covers the entire range of inputs. If I give a value which is outside that range, simply what is going to happen is that it will keep on subtracting 360 and then do the cosine operation on that. So in testing, you should make sure that your test data covers the entire range. In the login example, we can have no username, no password. Test the system with that. You can enter a username but don't enter the password. Test the system with that combination of test data. You can enter no password but only a username and test the system. And finally you can enter both the username and the password and test the system with that, to make sure that it works with all the combinations of the test data. Now, as we have already seen, the test data types are there. There are several types of test data. We have seen what is input test data and we have seen what is output test data. Input test data is what you enter into the system, and this can be entered via the system UI, or maybe you can put the input test data in some external data source like a CSV file, an Excel file, or a database. And there is the output data, which you need to compare with the output of the system. The output test data also can be either known to you ahead of time, or it can be generated on the fly. And again, output test data can also be stored in an external data source like a text file or Excel file or database, or it can be an image. There can be several sources of that. So test data can be divided into input test data and output test data. Another test data type is there which not all people consider, and that is the system configuration data. Well, the system stores its configurations. It can store its configuration in some INI file, or it can store the configuration in a database table, or it can store it at some other place. What does the configuration of the system contain? Well, it contains several settings of the system. There are some important settings of the system like database connection string. If it is a database driven system, then the system has to connect to its database in order to query the information and store different data in the database. The connection string is what is required to connect to the database server and the appropriate database. So you should consider what happens if you give an invalid connection string. So does the system work? If it does not work, does it crash, or it just is silent about the error? So is there a problem that you see when you're giving no connection string? What if you give an invalid connection string? Part of the string is correct, part of the string is invalid. So what happens then? So does the system crash, or it just hangs, or does it give or is it silent, or does it give an appropriate error message? So you need to test the system with that. There can be many such configuration settings, and you can apply the previously discussed useful tests by giving no test data, invalid test data, and data across its entire range. Systems also have another test data, and that you can see in how the system is displayed to the user. For example, there can be menu items, and menu items can also exist in the configuration, or it can be stored separately. So for instance, we saw in the Wikipedia, when it showed the article, at that time it showed several links along the article. So here we can see all these links along with the article. Now all this are also test data. It is coming from within the system. So the system should be able to correctly handle it. What if you change the system input data so that these links are no longer present, or you enter too many links, or you enter very lengthy links? So what happens in those cases? So that should also be tested. Another example is let's say it's an e-commerce shopping website, and it has a number of products in it, and you're testing the system. You're giving some inputs, and you are checking whether the outputs are correct or not. Well, the e-commerce shopping website also has the products with which it operates. And what if there were no products within the system? So does it still work, or does it give the error message, or does it crash? You need to find out if there is any problem with that. What if there were too many products over there? Does it slow down, or is it able to handle it correctly? So you can vary the different test data, work on the different test data. So design the different test data to test all these useful things. Basically, what if you don't have any test data? Does the system work correctly or not? Does the system work correctly with invalid test data or not? And does the system work correctly with all combinations of test data or not? Another test data type is the transaction data generated in the system. For instance, in the e-commerce shopping website, a new customer can enter their profile and their username, password, email address, their shipping information, billing information, etc. They can set up all these things in the profile. That profile information itself is test data, and you can apply different tests on that test data to see whether the system works correctly or not. Same thing goes for the orders also. The order created in the system is also a test data. So again, you should apply all these tests. What if you try to create a blank order? Does it work correctly or not? What if you specify invalid information in the order? Does it work correctly or not? What if you give an order with very small quantity or a very large quantity? Does it work correctly or not? So this is the different types of test data. So to recap, we have discussed what is test data. All data that is used in testing is test data. At a very basic level, there are two types of test data: input test data and output test data. Input test data is the data that you enter into the system, the data with which you configure the system, the data with which you populate the system. That is all the input test data. The output test data is the data with which you compare the output of the system. So it can both input test data and output test data can either be recorded ahead of time, or you can think of them at the time of testing only and perform the test. Also, input test data and output test data, if they are designed ahead of time before the test, so that time it is possible to store the input test data and output test data in a separate place, like a text file, an Excel file, a database, or some other place, any repository. Some useful tests you should always consider when you're designing the test data for use in the test. What if you don't give the test data? So what is the output you expect from the system when no test data is given? What if the test data is invalid? So you can design some invalid test data, and you should know what is the expected output of the system when the invalid test data is given. Then another useful test is that you can design the input test data across its entire range so that it covers all the different equivalence classes. And also, corresponding to every input test data, you should also design the output test data that you are expecting from the system. We also saw the test data is of different types. So there is input and output test data. Also, there is some test data which is not so obvious, so you should also pay attention to that and include that in your test. Example of this data is the system configuration data. For example, the system default settings for timeout, or server names which it accesses, web services that it accesses, database connection strings, and so on. It can be the system data used to populate the system. For example, the menus shown by the system, the products shown by the system, the different content shown by the system. And also there is another type of test data, which is the transaction data, which is what you create in the system and what output you expect from it. So I hope you now have a fair idea about what is test data and what are the different types of test data and how you can design different types of test data to have a better testing. Thank you.